In this clip, I'm going to walk you through the sequencer on board the MPC2000XL, most of which should also work on the non-XL model. So if you find the clip useful, let me know by hitting the thumbs up and subscribe and check out the channel for more walkthroughs just like this one. If you've just picked up an MPC2000 or considering buying one, then this series should help you familiarise yourself with the features on board and, most importantly, how to use them. For those already experienced with the 2000, use the index markers across the timeline to skip over what you already know, and if you're new to the series, check out the other chapters via the links below and feel free to leave any questions or comments. For best viewing, I highly recommend putting the clip in full screen mode on a TV, desktop or laptop. Switch the resolution to 1080p via the settings widget on the bottom right, and that should help increase visibility of the small LCD. And it's probably a good idea to have your MPC close by and pause the clip between each feature so you can test out the functions as we go. With that said, let's first rip into the cold hard stats about this little monster of a sequencer. MPC sequences, as you can see here, labelled SQ, are numbered starting from 1, and you can have up to 99 sequences in memory at any one time. Sequences can be thought of as virtual parts for your songs, and these can be any particular length you like, up to 999 bars long, and each sequence contains up to 64 tracks each. If we dive a little deeper, your time signature that you can see here, labelled T-sig, by default is set to 4/4. That means each bar contains 4 beats, or 4 quarter notes, and each quarter note contains 96 ticks. For any newbies watching, clock ticks are like your dots per inch, so consider the ticks as your resolution for where your played notes may land or be placed on. You also have a stack of alternate time signatures available to you too, if you ever need things like 3/4 or 7/8, and we'll visit these a little later. So your 2000 can play 32 samples or 32 voices simultaneously, and it can also transmit 32 channels of MIDI to external MIDI instruments as well, all at the same time. You've got a tempo range here between 30 BPM all the way up to 300 BPM that you can change by keying in a value on the keypad, plus decimal point, or dialing it in with the data wheel. Or even tapping it in real time by tapping a couple of times on the tap tempo button here. The sequencer as a total can hold a capacity of 300,000 events, not notes but events, so things like pitch bend values, aftertouch or other types of controller values for that matter are all counted as events. Each sequence can retain up to 50,000 events. It is possible to record sequences with more than 50,000 events, but unfortunately it's not possible to save or load beyond the 50,000 event capacity, which is a shame, but I suspect that may be a limitation of the old file system rather than the operating system itself. So when you power on your 2000, it'll run a quick system check to see how much memory is on board and what accessories can be detected. Then you'll be directed to this main screen that you can see here. And if for whatever reason you end up on another page somewhere else, you can always just hit the main screen button here to return you to this page, which is the nerve center of the MPC sequencer. And you'll be seeing a lot of this page if you plan on using your MPC as your main sequencer. The good thing is you can get right into all these settings in such a way that benefits your workflow, your studio, and whatever external instruments you plan on using with it. So if you wanted a DAW-less environment, then the 2000 could easily be the control center of your studio that triggers other drum machines, synthesizers, samplers. It could even trigger plugins in a DAW for that matter. If you decide to customize all your tracks with names and channels in a sequence specifically customized for your studio, then you can save that and configure an AutoLoad file to automatically load custom sequences each time you power on your 2000, which is kind of like the equivalent of a default template. That way, each time you turn on your MPC, it's ready to roll with your keyboard names, MIDI channels, maybe even a drum kit or some other sounds for that matter. And we'll get into that a little later too. But for now, let's just view this from the perspective of a default factory sequence. The basic concept behind MPC sequences is that they're your sketches or parts for your songs. So you can either build a complete song out of one long sequence that's fully edited and arranged, or you can make lots of smaller sequences and then chain them together like a playlist, and that's done using song mode, which we'll dive into towards the end of this clip. But as it happens, this particular relationship between sequences and song mode is still prevalent in the current range of MPCs today, so not a lot has changed in 20 plus years in that respect. If we cursor up to the track field, as mentioned earlier, you can have up to 64 tracks per sequence, and those 64 tracks could be any one of your 4 drum programs and or any of your external MIDI instruments. And as the 2000 has 2 physical MIDI ports on the rear, each port labelled A and B can transmit up to 16 MIDI channels each, and you access those by dialing them in here. So starting with MIDI channel 1 on port A, all the way up to MIDI channel 16 on port A, and then MIDI channel 1 on port B, all the way through to channel 16 on port B. So hypothetically, you could be triggering 32 external MIDI instruments along with playing 32 samples on board the MPC, together giving you a grand total of 64 tracks, which is probably twice what the average MPC owner will ever need, but it's there if you ever decide to create your magnum opus. The thing I like most about these older MPCs is their ability to sequence in different ways. Between the 2000 and the MPC 4000, the sequences on board can still run rings around the current range of MPCs. Sure, I can use a touchscreen on the new range, but there are some really great options for external MIDI gear in this particular sequencer that you just won't find on the newer versions, oddly enough. Anyway, enough of the sequencer overview. I'll assume you know a little bit about navigating your way around an MPC in terms of opening windows, renaming titles, dialing in values, etc. If you're not familiar with those particular things, then you should probably check out the first chapter in the series called Navigating Your MPC. With that said, let's dive right in. Starting with the top right, where we can see the Now field. By default, this will reflect the bars, beats, and tick position of where your imaginary playhead is located in relation to your sequence's timeline. But if we hit Open Window, we can toggle an alternate view to hours, minutes, and seconds, which is useful if your MPC is synced via SMPTE or MTC and you're working to video. And if that is the case, then you can offset your start point, and you can also change the frame rate accordingly to match that of your external device's timecode configuration. It's probably not ideal to change this unless you are using those methods of sync, but sometimes I'd use that view to get an idea of the duration of my sequences, especially if I'm working to time constraints. So I'll leave this as bars, beats, and clock for now, and let's cursor down to the bar field. So this number here represents how many bars are in that particular sequence up there, and if we were to hit Open Window, we can access a couple of functions to delete or add blank bars to our current sequence. On the left side, I can specify the number of bars I want to insert and which bar I want them inserted after. So if I wanted to insert one blank bar at bar 3, then I'd dial in 2 into the after bar field, and then I'd dial in 1 into the number of bars field. Doing this would insert 1 bar after bar 2. So then I'd hit the insert soft key to insert that bar. Now you can see that the number of bars for this sequence has increased by 1. Now that we've done that, this undo light has lit up, indicating that we could undo that last step. And that's the nature of the undo button. It will light up after most changes to indicate that you have the option to undo your last move. And I should mention that there's only ever one undo step, not like modern operating systems with unlimited undos. You're literally limited to the last change you made, which allows you to audition your last change before you commit or abandon it altogether. So I'll leave that for now, and let's jump back into the change bars window again. Now on the right hand side, there's the delete section where we can specify which bars to delete by declaring a range, starting with the first bar and then followed by the last bar. But similar to after bar on the left, you need to factor in the preceding bar before you delete, because if you're not careful, you could erase the bar before the point that you intend to delete. For example, if we quickly make this an 8-bar sequence, that we want to cut in half. Then I'd delete 5 through 8. Now that looks odd, but the end of the 4th bar finishes 1 tick position before it rolls on to 5. So if you keep a mental note of that, then the terminology after bar starts to make more sense, because you won't want to cut before the end of the bar that you intend to keep. You cut after the length of the bar you intend to keep. And technically, the end of each beat or bar is the 95th tick. After that, it becomes the start of the next beat or the next bar. So as we were saying before, if we want to cut an 8-bar loop in half, then I'd cut 5 to 8 and then hit the delete soft key. And there you have it. We're now 4 bars shorter than we were before. Alternatively, you can select the bar fill value and just rotate the data wheel a notch to reveal this pop-out, which is the basic version of the change bars window. And this is like a shortcut to modify the length of bars in your sequence. You'll get a cautionary notification either way about how the shortening of bars will delete notes or MIDI events, opposed to adding additional bars, which will add blank bars to the end of your sequence. And if you end up in this window for whatever reason and decide you need the comprehensive version of change bars, we can also access that change bars window by pressing the in/del soft key here. So you've got a couple of ways to insert or delete bars. But let's hit close and exit that window. Now let's take a look at the locate controls that we have here. Starting with the step keys, these have a dependency on your timing setting, aka quantize. Each press of a step key, either forwards or backwards, will jump incrementally based on that particular timing setting there. So if your timing is set to off, then the step keys will move in either direction by ticks. In addition to that, you can use the bar keys here to jump in either direction by bar. Or you can cursor up to the now field and just use your data wheel to dial forwards or backwards by either bars, beats or ticks, depending on which part of the field your cursor is highlighting. And then further to that, this GoTo button that you can see here is a feature you can use to memorize your often visited sequence locations. So if you're constantly jumping to a specific location in time, then you can store up to 9 location or go-tos as favorites. So we've got a location at the top here labeled go-to, and all we need to do is store that under any one of these 9 go-to positions and then hit the store soft key. And if I wanted to go back to it by hitting the go-to button, then locating your favorite and hitting the go-to soft key to jump to that specific point. Beneath the locator keys, we've got the record and play options. Play start will always play from the beginning of your sequence, while play will just continue on from whichever position is displayed here in the now field. Stop will stop the MPC from recording or playing, and record should be considered as your erase and record option, while overdub should be considered as your add to existing option. The only real difference between record and overdub is that record will erase any part of your track that the playhead rolls over, and if loop is on, then record will automatically switch to overdub when the sequence loops back to the start, which is smart because you wouldn't really want it to erase the part you just laid down. And if loop is off, then recording or overdub record will keep recording until stop is pressed, regardless of the predetermined length of bars that's in your current sequence. Your loop option is on by default, and that can be toggled off with your data wheel, like I just did. But what's even cooler about the loop function is that if you hit the open window on it, you're given some options that allow you to adjust the loop range. And you can alter values in both the first and last fields, or rather than set the last field to end, as you can see here, which is the default, you can just key in a specific number of bars for your loop. And this is really handy if you just want to work on a small section of bars in a really long sequence. Moving over to the count field, hit the open window. Here we've got a great bunch of options that allow us to configure the metronome in various ways, like switching it on or off, We can set it to click during play and or not record. And we can decide whether or not the click is to be heard during count-in for recording or recording and playing. Or you can have it disabled completely. The rate below tells us that we'll get 4 clicks per bar when the metronome is on, which we can change from quarter notes right up to 30-second triplets. And we can also enable the wait for key option as well, which you can see here. So if we toggle that to on, and this is a great option for when you're not at arm's length of the MPC. So using wait for key is like having a ghost trigger to kickstart your MPC into record or play or whatever these settings above have been configured to do. By default, this is off, but if you toggle it on, each time you go to record or overdub, you'll need to hit a pad first or trigger a note on your MIDI instrument to initiate the count-in prior to recording or whatever you've configured your metronome to do. Okay, so let's check this out real quick. I've got a drum program already loaded, so I'll select drum program 1, turn the MIDI channel off, put my quantize setting, timing setting to 16, put loop on, and now when I hit record and play start, now it's going to wait for any pad or note. So I need to just trigger one of those sounds off my drum program, and then we'll get the metronome count in, and then we're off. Okay, good. So if we jump back into the count page, this time we'll check out the sound tab. In here we can modify the actual sound of the click by selecting click and changing it to any one of the 4 drum programs. You could even allocate 2 different sounds to represent your metronome by selecting an accented sound versus the normal sound. And you can adjust the velocity of the levels independently as well. And for the newbies, your accented note occurs on the start of each bar, or the 1, while the normal note would occur for every beat or measure based upon your rate on the previous window. So for example, I could use that as my accent, and then my normal sound, I could choose to have that, then close, and then turn wait for key off, just so we can get the count in so you can get an idea of what that sounds like. And then that would be the count in. So if we jump back into the count page again and back to sound, I'll put that back to click. And now let's take a look at the output field. What we can do with this is we can take the click out of the main stereo output and route it through one of your 8 individual outputs, provided that you have the 8 individual output option installed in your 2000. And sometimes I'd like to use the metronome as a click track and record it as a separate output into my DAW. I did a video on this called Tracking MPCs and SB1200s. So if you'd like to learn more about that particular technique for recording MPCs into a DAW, it's a really tight method of getting old drum machines onto the grid in most popular DAWs without a need to sync. Anyway, I'll put this back into stereo for now, and let's get back to the main screen. So if you take a look across the bottom of the display, you'll notice all the soft keys, and these are activated by these function keys labeled F1 through F6. So starting from the far right, the F6 soft key is labeled TR+, and pressing this will advance your current track up by 1. So if I'm on track 1, pressing TR+ will advance me into track 2, and then anything we record now will be contained in track 2. And similarly, if we press the track minus key, we're put back into the previous track. So I'll go ahead and quickly throw down a couple of tracks. So TR+ into the next track above, and you can see that it's labeled unused, and that tells me there's nothing in that particular track. So I'll record a part in there. I'll just change that to drum program 1 and record and play start. And then I'll go to track 3, which is again unused, select the drum program, and now record something else. All right, basic, but it's just for the demo. Now that we've got some content scattered across a few tracks, I can select any of the tracks I want to copy or delete and hit open window. And from here, I can delete or copy this particular track, or by tapping a pad or moving the data wheel on the track name, we've got an option to rename the track, or I can copy the name into a buffer and paste that into another track as well. So that's all very useful. But if we jump back into the track window, if I hit delete, you can see in here we've got an option to delete all tracks, which will delete every track in the sequence, or I can just delete the single track or select another track to delete as well from here. And I won't do that. What I want to do is copy track 3 to track 4. And I could copy track 3 over track 1 or track 2, but I'll look for an unused track that you can see here and then hit do it. And now track 3 is in also track 4. It's a copy of track 3. So I don't need track 4, so I'll delete that, even though it's called track 3, and then go back into track 3. And now that I've got a few tracks recorded, I can get a little bit of an overview if I hit this track mute button here. And we can see all the unused tracks that are available to record parts in, but also the used tracks 1, 2, and 3 that do have parts in them. And the cool thing with this page is tapping a pad will toggle that relative track's mute status. So tapping pad 1 will mute track 1, tapping pad 2 will mute track 2, and tapping pad 3 will mute track 3. So I can mute them all or all at the same time, and it's very handy. So if I play the sequence, anyway, you get the idea. And the good thing is, if you have more than 16 tracks, you select pad bank B, C, or D to access higher numbered tracks in groups of 16. So pad bank A, as you can see here, is the first 16 pads correlating to the first 16 tracks in your sequence. Then pad bank B is tracks 17 through 32. Then pad bank C represents tracks 33 all the way up to 48. And then pad bank D are tracks 49 all the way up to 64. And they're your 64 tracks. And as a note, even though your sequence is currently selected here, you can't change it while it's playing. You can change it while it's not playing, but if I play, it's locked. I kind of find that annoying, but anyway, it's not the end of the world. Okay, I should also mention that sequences will remember the status of their track mutes. So if you go to another sequence and then come back, in this case, my track 2 will remain muted until I unmute it. Finally, on this page, we have the solo function, which is the opposite of mute. So holding down the solo soft key followed by tapping any particular pad will mute every other track instantly. And the solo functions like a lock. So to release it, just hit the solo button again, and all the other tracks will become unmuted. And so I'll give you a little demo of that. There you go. So let's jump back to the main screen. And here you can see the solo soft key on this screen as well. So depending on which track we're in, we could just play. And you can see it flashing when it's activated. And whichever track you're currently selected is the track that is currently soloed. And so unlock that. And to the left of solo, we have the track mute soft key. And track mute will turn off the currently selected track, which is useful if you want to hear the parts in your sequence without the parts on the currently selected track. So And if you press this repeatedly, you'll notice the on field toggles between yes and no. And if you cursor over the on field, you have a great little feature hiding behind it. So hit the open window button on it, and you're presented with a very fast way of deleting multiple tracks in just the press of a button. This function will purge the contents of all the tracks that have an on status of no. In other words, deleting all tracks that are off. And I'll show you that just after we record one more track in this sequence. Record play start, and off we go. Alright, that's good enough. So now before I trash these parts, I'll quickly make a copy of this sequence, cursor up to the sequence field, hit open window, and we can see copy, but there's also this other function here labeled default. And this allows you to customize the names of new sequences. For example, changing this to ToneLab, I could just use the data wheel and then the letters. Now every new sequence I create will bear the name ToneLab rather than just a boring old sequence. But I won't forget about the copy that I need to make, so I'll copy this particular sequence to another sequence position, and you can see there it's numbered 2. And these sequence numbers can be useful because you could send MIDI program changes to the 2000 from another device to cue a particular sequence to play next. For now, I'll just use this first unused slot for my duplicate. And then you've got two choices. You've got do it, which will duplicate your entire sequence, or param, which is parameters. And what that does is copies the configuration of your sequence, so things like track names, MIDI channels, pretty much everything except the content in those tracks, which might be the right option if you just want a blank canvas but the same track configuration as what you were just working on previously. So let's hit do it to copy the sequence. And now let's check out the erase all off tracks feature in action. But first I'll mute some tracks. I'll just mute track 2, 3, and 4. Go back to main screen, hover over the track status field, hit open window, and now we see pressing do it will erase all off tracks. So hit the do it soft key. Now if we go back to track mute, we'll see that tracks 2, 3, and 4 are now all back to unused. So it's a really great feature. It encourages really fast workflow, and it's like one of those tricks that enables you to leap tall buildings in a single bound. And if your style of workflow relies on building lots of parts and then muting parts away as a means of arranging your song, then you'll probably end up using that every session. Speaking of deleting, there's a very comprehensive erase feature conveniently placed next to the undo button. So pressing the erase button opens the erase window where you can accurately pinpoint exactly what to erase and where from. And the good thing is you don't need to be in the specific track you want to delete something from either. You can just key in or dial into any particular track you want something removed from. And you could input a specific time range in your sequence, like I could just delete the contents of the last beat of the last bar. The thing to note with the erase function is, if you're on a drum track, your notes field will look a little different to that of a MIDI track. On a drum track erase page, you have specific pads that you can delete, or you can use your wheel to scroll to any specific pad that you want, or you can just tap it. And it doesn't stop there. You're probably getting a sense of how powerful this simple criteria system is, because it acts like a filter, more or less, to permanently remove certain things from certain ranges. But it goes beyond that. If you jump into the track field, you can dial in 0, but there is no track 0. So the 2000 has a special all tracks option that lives at track 0. And now the criteria on this page will be executed across all tracks. Below the time range, we have the erase mode, and this is where things start to get a little interesting. So by default, you have the option for all events, which will remove anything and everything. But if you dial clockwise, you'll see the all except option. And this is really cool because you could potentially remove everything in a section except one specified note here in the notes field. So if we recap for a moment and look at what's currently configured above, the erase feature is set to erase all tracks between the time range of beat 4, bar 4 to bar 5, and then it's going to erase everything except that particular note there, which is 11. If that snare was a drum fill, then that's a very powerful option to have everything else disappear except your drum fill. And that drum fill example is the most basic task it can handle, because if you dig a little deeper, you can choose other types of events that can be immune from the erase function, almost like MIDI immunity for pitch bend, controller information, which can be set to any of the 128 different controller types or IDs, program changes, channel pressure, poly pressure, exclusive information, etc. So very powerful in that respect. And then you've got another erase mode, which is only erase notes. So again, you can just single out a specific note on any particular track and any point in the time range and then do it. And so if we were to do that now, I'll go back to all except and make sure my snare's there, activate that, and now that's what I just programmed it to do. And if it was a MIDI track, you've almost got the exact same thing. So if I was to go switch that to MIDI and then do erase, everything's virtually the same, except this time we've got a range of notes. So you could erase all sorts of different keys in a particular range, or if you've got a keyboard split or whatever, you can just remove the bass or just the piano. So that's a very comprehensive criteria system that allows you to remove just about anything from your sequence. But further to that, it can punch holes in complex or busy parts with just a few keystrokes. Plus there's an old school method of erasing notes too, which is reminiscent of the SP1200 method, and that is if you go into overdub, get into the specific track first, overdub and play start, and then hold down the erase button and hold down the hi-hat, or just a snare. And the good thing is I still have a backup of my original sequence that's all untouched before I started messing around with it. And what I'll do now is I'll make another copy of that original sequence because I don't want to mess that up. And I'll copy again, and this time copy the duplicate to number 3. And now we can have a look at some of the editing tools that we have under Edit and Step. Hitting the Edit soft key reveals a great little set of tools, and really well thought out too. If you get familiar with these features early, the ideas that come to you will take shape very quickly. Starting with the tabs along the bottom, first in line is the Events page, where we can copy all notes or just a single note, or by tapping on the pad. And I should mention, similar to the erase window, if you have a MIDI track selected, it's not a single note, it'll be a range of notes, opposed to the drum track, which is a single note or all. And if we change the edit mode up on the top, we can modify specific things just like the duration of a note or the velocity of a note, or we can transpose a particular note in key. But don't get the wrong idea about transpose, because it will function differently between drum tracks and MIDI tracks. It won't alter the pitch of samples inside the 2000. It will, however, transpose the notes that those pads generate when you tap them in. And for an example, if your kick is on C1 and your snare is on D1, and you transpose your kick upwards by 2 semitones, then those kick notes will start triggering your snare on D1. Because essentially, you've just shifted the note at C1 up to D1. Hence this little message here that says, accept drum track. So let's check out how copy works. First thing you would do is consider what you need to copy, then single out the part or range from the sequence you want to copy from, So for example, if I wanted to copy bar 3 to bar 5 from sequence 3 over to sequence 2, and instead of pasting it on track 1 where it currently exists, I could copy it into a completely different track on another sequence, or virtually anywhere from this tiny little window. The interesting thing is the part I decide to copy can be added to whatever exists in the destination by selecting merge, or you can replace what's currently sitting there in that destination by using the replace mode. You've also got the option to specify a completely different start point by providing a new bar or new beat position into the start field. And I could repeat it as many times as I want. So I could stick that right on the end and repeat that 4 times. Otherwise, if I wanted it to go in reference to where I pulled it from, I could just nominate the same bar, beat and tick position here too. So let's give this a shot by hitting do it and check that destination sequence for the track and where it starts and repeats. We can see that the bars have increased dramatically. Let's have a look at track mute. That's on track 2 now. That's exactly where we put it. Okay, good. Now what I should do just quickly is, because we've used a lot of editing modes for the internal drum programs, I might just quickly throw down a MIDI track that we can use with an external synth. Using this Trombone Solaris that I've got sitting here next to me. And I'll just quickly put a bass down using MIDI channel 1 on this particular MIDI track. That'll do, that'll be fine. Right, that'll do it. Now, one thing that might be confusing some people, I can still trigger my MIDI keyboard despite the fact that I'm not playing on it, but I can do either or. It's still triggering MIDI notes. So now we've got a keyboard part, we can transpose the pitch of that rather than try to transpose that on a drum track, which wouldn't be very exciting at all. So let's go back into the edit page, and rather than transpose the whole thing, I'll just transpose the 3rd bar for the rest of the duration up by 4 semitones, like so. And then if you hit do it, then it should play the original pitch up until bar 3 and then go up 4 semitones. Anyway, you get the idea. Okay, so jumping back into edit mode, this time let's alter some notes using something obvious like duration. First you would change the edit mode to duration, then cursor over to mode, and rather than just add a value to the duration of your notes, I could subtract some length, or I could multiply the value by say 50%. But the thing to note here is 100% is the neutral value or the original length of your note, and 200% would be twice as much, or 50% would be half the original length. So if I wanted to increase the length of notes by 50%, then I'd dial in 150. But I did say we're going to double it, so let's just go for 200%. And hit the do it key, and let's try that. Anyway, you get the idea. Let's jump back into edit page. This time we can check out the bar tab where we can copy any particular range of bars from one sequence to another. And this would come in useful if you needed to extend an already existing sequence, like doubling it up in length or quadrupling it, etc. But the thing to be aware of with this is the track data gets copied across explicitly in its original form, no matter how the tracks on the destination sequence are configured. So if you don't have the exact same order or lineup of tracks, in your destination sequence, then the parts would arrive there mismatched and probably sound pretty crazy too. And so let's just quickly have a little play with this. I'll take our original sequence back from 12 bars down to 4. And then what I'll do is go back into Edit Page on the bar tab and grab the first bar from first bar to last bar, and then paste that and make one copy of it. So we've got a 4-bar loop. Essentially what should happen now is, if I hit the do it, we should double it. And now we've got the 8 bars. All right, cool. Anyway, jumping back into the edit page again, this time let's check out the TR move option, which is the track move. And with this, you can reorder your tracks, like bring the drums down to the first 8 tracks, or move a bass line or synth part down from a different bank closer to the front or wherever you prefer them, which might be useful in a scenario that requires certain bunches of tracks to be accessible within one particular pad bank. And then you've got them accessible via track mute view. That way you can mute an array of tracks that complement each other rather than having to jump from bank to bank in track mute view. To do that, you first select the track you need to move. I'll select track 1, which is the drum track, and then hit the select soft key. Then use your cursor arrows up and down to find a new position, which I think 5 might be empty. Yeah, that's good there. And then hit the insert soft key, and bingo, you're done. So let's check that out. Solo, that's the drums. So unsolo. Okay, good. If we jump back into the edit page for the last time, we can take a quick look at the user tab. And this page lets you configure the default values for a new sequence, which is then saved to the internal flash memory on the MPC. So even when you turn off your MPC without saving to disk, it'll still be in there. And here you can set things like the preferred tempo. You may like to begin with 105 beats per minute or whatever. So you could just key that in. How many bars you like to start with. I generally like to start with 4. You can set whatever time signature you like, whatever MIDI channel your favorite keyboard's on, and whatever patch is in that favorite keyboard of yours. Then you've got your loop status, plus you can delegate your preferred drum program or MIDI instrument as well. And you've also got this little S here, which represents single, or you've got multi-track mode as well, which we'll get into shortly. The thing to note about flash memory is that it needs a little help to nudge it along before you see your custom defaults. So don't be alarmed if you see the factory defaults rather than the user default. All you need to do is go to a blank sequence and then hit cursor down, and you'll see the BPM and whatever else that you set. Oh, we've also got the default sequence name now in place too. So next up, let's have a look at what step editing is all about. Hitting the step soft key will take us into step edit for this particular track that we're on, which is kind of like a video frame editor where you can scroll in bars, beats, or even ticks, frame by frame, similar to jog or shuttle modes of a video editor. But you can also use your locate keys to step forward or back by bars or even steps, and which again is based on your time correction setting here. So holding down the TC soft key will reveal your time setting that you can alter with the data wheel. So if we use the step left key to go back as far as we can, we'll end up at the very first tick position on bar 1. Then depending on your TC value, if that's set to 16, then using the step arrows will jump in increments of 24 ticks. If I change the TC value by rotating the data wheel to a resolution of 32 steps per bar, the steps we take now will be shorter, and the timing correction will permit us to jump in between where we could previously. And if you hold down the GoTo button and use the bar arrows, you can jump to the first bar or the last bar, or as it's labelled here, under the arrow buttons, start and end. But if you look under the arrows on this side, you get another cool little trick where you can jump automatically to the next note or event in either direction, kind of like a heat seeker almost. And that's really useful in situations where you've got a ghost note or controller event hiding somewhere between your TC positions that you might be having a tough time finding. I don't think we've got any notes on this track, so let's just change this back to sequence 3 and go back to step edit. So now we should be able to use GoTo and find the next event. Next bar. Okay, good. In addition to that, you've got a great little set of tools here, like copy, delete, insert, paste, and play. Copy, I'm sure, needs no introduction. Delete, one press, and the note is gone. Insert, on the other hand, allows you to insert various types of generic events that you can then customize. So you could insert a dummy note if you wanted to by hitting insert, or a pitch bend, a control change event, a program change event, a channel pressure event, poly pressure event, system exclusive event. And you could even insert a mixer event. And yep, it's true, the mixer in the MPC2000 can be recorded. If you visit the Shift 7 and then go to the setup and then change this option here, record mix changes. If you change that to a yes, then anything you see here, while it's playing, you can record all these things moving. So pan adjustments, level adjustments, and then you can go into step edit and fine tune all that stuff. So it's a great little option. I won't activate that now. Then you can edit those events in the step edit window like this. So you can go through here, you can adjust the controller values, the program change numbers, the channel pressure values, all this stuff. It's a huge amount of detail. And then if you look at this tick position we have now, we've got all sorts of things happening on this particular frame. So if we step forward and step back, and I'll just adjust the TC to be 16 again. And so if we use the steps, we can go forward a bar or back a bar, and now you can see all the different frames that are occurring. So step forward, back to the start. And so now that you can see on bar 1, beat 1, and tick 00, that we've got all sorts of things happening. So if we step forward, we go to a position where there's not many events and things going on. But if we jump back to bar 1, all sorts of things are going on. So now you can sort of get an idea for the frames that we're working with and what each frame can store in terms of notes, MIDI control information, mixer automation events, and all kinds of things. And you can also use your cursor up and down and left and right to go into all these different controllers and their values and things. And I won't bore you with that rabbit hole in this particular episode because a lot of that relies on external MIDI devices. But I'll just sweep through the options for controller quickly so you can get a sense of how advanced the 2000 can be if you need that level of control over external instruments. So this parameter here is like a bank select message, and you can change the value here. And then we've got mod wheels, which you can change the value there for that. Breath controller, then you've got a undefined controller number, foot controllers, portamento time, data entry. You know, you can see it all here. It's nuts. It's got everything. So there really isn't much it can't do in terms of manipulating external MIDI devices. So while we've got all this gibberish on the screen, it's probably a good time to demonstrate how you can select multiple events in one hit. So starting from the first or the last event in the list, you just hold down Shift and then use the cursor to kind of drag a little kind of square around or highlight a bunch of controllers or notes or whatever you need. And from there you can copy or delete. And so what I'll do is I'll copy it and then I'll delete these notes. And then what we can do is we can jump forward to another step in time. We can jump to a different bar and then paste. And it'll ask, do you want to paste it? If you say yes, then it'll just spit out all those particular events or notes or whatever you've just selected and copied. And then once you've pasted them in, obviously you can go back and change all the values again. So we'll delete all these because we don't really need all that. So just keep deleting them, highlight and delete. Nothing there, so back to bar 1. And there's also a method to edit multiple values in a step as well. So again, by selecting either the first or last note, holding down Shift and using the cursor, but this time what you can do is move left or right to select which particular field you want to edit multiples of. So we've got the V for velocity and we've got the D for duration. And we've also got the tuning field here as well. So if I want to edit the duration for all these particular notes, I'd leave the column highlighted for D for duration and then hit edit. And now it says edit multiple, and I can set the value to a set value, or I could have the other options that we discussed earlier: add value, subtract the value, multiply value by percentage, set to a static value. So we'll set this to 30 and then hit do it. And now you can see both events in that list are now sharing a decay of 30. And you can use this play soft key here to trigger any of those particular notes, which is useful if you need to isolate or test a program change or maybe the velocity of a note that you've just edited. So you could keep changing the duration and keep re-triggering the note with the play soft key in order to test the program changes or fine-tune your velocity like this. Or the kick. So you can get right into every little nuance and change everything right down to a fine art. All the way left, we have the note numbers that are represented by the letter N that you can see there. Unlike MIDI tracks, notes actually have a tune field, which gives you the ability to adjust the tuning of that particular pad at that moment in time without affecting the drum program. So if we were to dial in a little bit of a change, or just go back to 0. And in a MIDI track, it looks a little bit like this. I've got no MIDI notes on this particular track. Oops, main screen. Let's go back to, I think the MIDI track's on sequence 2. So here, yeah, I think we've got MIDI there. So let's go step, and then we can just play that. Yep, that's a Solaris MIDI note. So you can see the MIDI note on this one actually says the word note. And because we're on a MIDI track, we've got a little bit of a different representation of that key. We don't have a tune field like we did on the drum track. So either way, you can easily transpose these particular notes or drums by selecting it with a cursor and dialing it in either direction, and then hitting the play key after each change can act like a little bit of an auditioning function. There's an event filter at the top up here, which is useful if you only want to work on Aftertouch or perhaps an external MIDI controller. So you cursor up there and then scroll through the different controllers. And that could be controlling the frequency of a synth filter, and you can get in there and again change all the different types of controller IDs as well. So extremely comprehensive really. You'd have to refer to your synth manual to find out exactly what controller number that may be, but if you know it, you can put it in that particular value in there and create points throughout the sequence that possibly manipulate your synth filter or some other kind of function. There's also a hidden window that you can access by hitting open window anywhere underneath the top line. So somewhere on the screen like here, hit open window, and now you've got the step edit options. And here you can toggle the auto step increment feature to on, which will advance the sequencer position forward into your timeline by exactly the specified amount in your timing correction setting here. Below that, we have an option to modify the duration of recorded notes from as played, which is the length of time you hold your pads or keys down for in real time, opposed to the alternate option of the time correction value, which is to say whatever your timing correction value is, which is here on 16 at the moment, then what we can do is we can actually have 50% of that or just 100% of that fixed value. So regardless of however long you hold your notes down for, you'll get this particular timing correction value, maybe minus 50% or minus 25 or whatever you want to set that percentage to. So a couple of useful little features in there. If we close that, and now if I put down a, what's this sound here? If we jump back out and go to a different track, now notice that we've just stepped in forward. We've gone from there to there, and that's because the auto increment is now on. So if I turn that off and then go back to the start and tap a pad, we're still on the same step. So auto increment will automatically propel you forward, and that can be handy if you want to put in 16th hi-hats or something. And so that's a lot of meat and potatoes for the step edit section. So now that we've got a good understanding of that and what all these parameters are about, let's take a little look at step programming, because you don't necessarily always have to record in real time. The beauty or limitation of older sequences was that a lot of them came in from a period when there was no real-time record, but only step programming. And whether it's for nostalgia or maybe you're just hopeless at playing to a click, whatever the reason, you can do step programming on the 2000, and it can influence you to create differently. So experiment with that, because you'll either love it or hate it. And for an example, I might just get a clean sequence. Drum 1, and I'll just make this 2 bars. And so now auto increment is on. And for this example, if I've got a TC value of 16 and I've got a 2-bar loop, that means I'd need 16 steps per bar. So 2 bars, that means 32 steps. And then without actually needing to perform it in real time or to a click, the 2000 is ready to capture whatever you play. And provided I tap in 32 steps, that will complete the length of 2 bars. And notice how the MPC has been sitting there patiently the whole time, already in record, waiting for me to start playing. When you jump into step edit, you're instantly in overdub record. So whatever I start playing on the pads at this time, and you're not limited to pads either, you could be playing parts off a MIDI keyboard too, but because we've got auto increment on, the sequencer will automatically step me forward by the TC amount after each pad or note played. And you could also use your step or bar keys to jump back and forwards to revisit whichever location in the sequence. So let's try it out. Then if we listen back, the sequencer will play those steps back at whatever tempo you have on the main screen. All right, good. Now, I should mention that undo will only be available to you once you exit out of step edit. Then you can undo the whole thing, like it's the whole session and everything you did in there. Or to put it in another way, the 2000 will consider all of the changes you made in your last visit to step edit as one undo step. And again, you can go in there and delete all those things, and you could also add to it in real time as well on top of everything else. So it compounds quite comprehensively when you use all these different facets, or you get used to all these different facets of the sequencer on board this thing. So now we've seen the concept of step programming and the way we can insert program changes that could recall a patch or preset on an external MIDI instrument. We can also set the PGM field here, which is the program change field. So if I was to play the Solaris, I could quickly change that. And if I change that to maybe 31, think that might be a bass. And so that's actually sending out program changes just for that specific track. So if you went to another track, you could actually have something else in here. So if I've got a Jupiter 6 sitting at channel 1, port B, and now if I play that, and if I change that program change number, and so now back to the Solaris. So you can easily dial up sounds from your external synths without actually having to get up. But the thing to note here is this is a program change event that occurs right at the start of the sequence. You can't edit this under step edit because it's not printed in the list of events. So think of it as being hard-coded into this particular sequence or that particular track. But the good thing is if you hit open window on it, you can disable the transmit changes in this track feature rather than dialing down through your patch numbers, or you can just select off that way. But if you wanted to remember the actual program, you'd want that to stay there, but then you'd want this turned off because otherwise every time you start the sequence, it'll re-trigger the patch. So if you make any changes to your patch, it'll keep recalling the patch at the start of the sequence. And as a tip, when I use these program changes, I tend to get a smoother ride when I add these manually in step edit insert. I just find that program changes that occur right at the beginning of the sequence can be abrupt and cause a little bit of a MIDI hiccup due to the patch recall times of some synthesizers. And that's because not all patches recall instantly. Some need a second or more, so I like to have a little bit of a lead time to allow a synth, especially the older ones, enough time to load and be ready to catch the first incoming notes comfortably, rather than catch the notes and the program changes right at the start of a sequence. Under the program field, we have the velocity field. This is kind of like a shortcut of going into edit mode and then manipulating velocity values across the range of the current sequence we're on. So if I was to manipulate this value now, everything on track 1 would be 85% of its original velocity. Or if I increase that to 200, it's twice the velocity of whatever the velocity was recorded. And if you hit open window, similar to what you saw on the edit events page, on the edit velocity page, we can isolate a particular section of bars or even notes on a keyboard. And again, thing to note is the drum track will only have pads. It won't have a note range that you can dial into. You'll be able to select all particular pads or one particular pad. So because we're on a MIDI track, we've got a key range here, and we could just dial in, say, from bar 3 to bar 5, and then we can add a particular value to the velocities that have already been recorded in our track. Or we could subtract some velocity, or again use a percentage to multiply the value, given that 200% is twice as much and 50% is half as much, and original value would be 100%. So while we have these edit modes fresh in our mind, let's take a look at how those same range tools can help us manipulate and correct the timing or feel of our tracks with the timing correction, which is where you can really massage the feel of your rhythm tracks or maybe even your keyboard parts. And the way you do that is just cursor over the timing field and hit the open window. But first I want to make sure we're messing around with a drum track. All right, that'll do. Now we can see this note value field highlighted, indicating that our current quantize setting is 16ths, or time correction, which means 16 steps per bar will be permitted. So if you're not great playing in time to a metronome, then this quantize is like having training wheels on your push bike. The thing is, a lot of people use it, so don't feel bad if you need it on all the time. Just try turning it off now and then and playing things in without it, because not everything needs to be so perfect all the time. Using the data wheel, we can change the note value, aka quantize resolution, from 16 to 8th notes all the way up to 32 triplets. And you can also turn it off, which would leave your beats or notes more or less as you played them in. To the right, we have the infamous MPC swing. The MPC swing defaults to 50%, which is no swing at all, or we can dial in up to 75% swing, which is quite an excessive type of swing. Below the swing, you've got the shifting amount, which can shift your notes by tick amounts in either direction by changing this element on the opposite side to earlier or later. So we could add 2 ticks and make the notes shift later, or you can make it 2 ticks earlier. And sometimes I'd use that to shift my claps earlier or hats later, depending on what feel you want. So I suggest you tinker around with it and experiment, because there's no wrong or right. And if you can make an interesting feel out of it, maybe you can develop your own style with it. So I wouldn't worry too much about what everyone else is doing. Just get in there and experiment. You know, if worse comes to worse and you mess it up, you hit undo and go and have another shot at it. And again, similar to the other edit pages, we've got a time range here that we can apply the settings above to. And if you're on a MIDI track, you won't just have one note that you can select or all, you'll have a range of notes that you can select too. So you could filter out just the lower half of your keyboard, or alternatively, you could apply these settings to just a couple of octaves. If you leave them on the default setting, then all notes will be affected by the above setting when you hit the Do It soft key. So I'll just mess with this for a minute and see if we can get something out of it. And I think we've got the original here. So you might be able to hear the difference. I'll exaggerate the snare a bit more. And the guitar one more time. And to the non-quantized version. Actually, I didn't think that's not on that track, is it? So let me just solo this. No, the guitar's not there. The guitar's there. All right, cool. So let me just edit this, and then now apply the swing to that guitar. To the original sequence. To the swing sequence. So it's very subtle, but that's the thing, you can get in there and make it as dramatic as you want. So make sure you experiment with all of those, because yeah, as you can see, you can get some really good detail in those swings. Next, we'll take a look at this dual purpose tap tempo and note repeat button. So while the tap tempo button may come across as fairly basic, we can modify the sensitivity if we hold down Shift and press 8 on the keypad to access the page called Other. And here you'll find a setting at the top called Tap Averaging, and what this does is calculate the beats per minute based on the duration of time between the taps on your tap button. So 2 taps in this case is what's currently required. However, if I change that to 4, then the tap tempo feature will require 4 taps before it calculates the average tempo. So if I go back to main screen, now we'll need 4 taps before the tempo is then calculated. You can have 2, but if you're a heavy hitter on the note repeat button, the tap tempo feature can accidentally trigger a tempo change right under your nose, which might ruin a performance or a recording. So it's good to be able to increase this option here in case you're accidentally setting off your tempo changes due to excessive note repeats. So while we're on the subject of note repeat, let's take a look at what we can do with the note repeat feature. So I might just leave this tap averaging on 4 so we don't trigger a tempo change. So while playing, or recording for that matter, you can press and hold down note repeat and hold down any pad or notes from your MIDI keyboard to get an automatically repeating note, almost like a machine gun. And the intervals of repetition are based on your timing setting here. So in this case, note repeat will repeat whichever pad or note I hold down 16 times per bar. And if I hold down note repeat and then press shift or main screen, then the button is latched down and note repeat will continue indefinitely without me holding it until I press stop or hit the note repeat button. So to give you an idea, now you can hear that swing, so I might just turn the swing off because it's a bit savage at the moment. And I might mute a couple of tracks. So this gives you two modes of note repeat, latched or free. And when you do free, and both have their advantages and disadvantages, so experiment with both and see what you prefer. I tend to prefer unlatched, but latched can be handy if you're doing straight 16th hi-hat patterns or something like that. And we can also use that for argument's sake. I'll show you how we can use that on a MIDI synth as well. So if I just dial in, and I could use that on the Jupiter 6 too. Bit of a long note, so there we go. This might be easier. So that works quite well with your MIDI instruments as well. So next we should take a look at the various things we can do with the tracks themselves. The first decision you'll probably make when you approach a new sequence or unused track is whether or not to select one of the 4 drum programs versus a MIDI program. And the short way of understanding the difference is to consider the drum programs as the sounds inside the 2000 opposed to one of the MIDI tracks. And the way you do that is shift your cursor right into this off field. As you rotate clockwise, you'll see we have 1A, device 01, then 2A, device 02, right up to 16A. So if we rotate past this, we now have 1B, all the way up to 16B, which is appropriately titled device 32. Together, they represent the 2 lots of 16 devices we can trigger via the MPC's MIDI output ports. And it doesn't stop there either. There's also a lot of hybrid-like modes for drum programs and MIDI channels you can use that may be useful to trigger other MPCs or drum machines. And all you need to do is pull up a drum program, then cursor across to the off field, then select any particular MIDI channel you'd like to send out on. Also taking the output port into account too. Just keep in mind that the note mapping of drum programs is different by default. So check out the video on programs for more about those. And so now if I tap the pads, you'll hear the Solaris and the drum program all playing at the same time. And just like an advent calendar, a lot of these fields contain additional options behind them. So in the case of the MIDI channel field here, we can once again hit Open Window. And if you hit the Monitor tab, you've got this great utility that helps you see the activity on any one of those MIDI output channels. So we can see there, and if I change the channel to 16, where the Jupiter 6 is, you can see it there. So this helps you see the activity on any one of those MIDI output channels across both MIDI ports. And you've also got this panic button in case you're freaking out. Actually, the panic button is kind of like a reset feature to send note off events across all MIDI channels of the MPC. So if any of your keyboards end up with a stuck note, you activate the panic button to send a reset all instruction across all MIDI channels across both ports. And just above the panic button, you've also got the option of naming all your devices, which would be a wise thing to do if you intend on creating a default template of all the instruments in your studio. And above that, the easiest way to describe the functionality of the soft through would be to say that it acts just like the physical MIDI through port on most keyboards or drum machines. And if you're unfamiliar with those, then another way of putting it is the soft through will reroute everything that your MPC receives via the MIDI input port out through either the A output port or the B output port or both A and B output ports. Alternatively, you can just disable it entirely by switching it off. But if you're not configuring half a dozen or more external instruments with your MPC2000, then it's best to leave the default as track, which will route any incoming MIDI messages via the current track's channel and port setting, which we've got here set to 1B on this particular track. Therefore, anything received on MIDI port 1 will be routed to channel 1 via output B. That might be confusing for some because the MIDI input ports are labelled 1 and 2, whereas the output ports are labelled A and B. The thing to note is if you're using multi-track recording, then the as track and single channel setting here will be superseded by the multi-track recording configuration. And if you're wondering what multi-track recording is, then let's take a look at that next. So if we mosey on over to the far left, you'll see the letter S here, which is indicating that we're currently in single track record mode. And if we toggle this option, we get the letter M. This puts the 2000 into multi-track record mode, which then gives you the ability to record multiple instruments across different channels and or ports all at the same time, which is great if you're jamming with some friends and you want to record everyone at the same time. And the way you set this up is really easy. Hit the Open Window button on the M to open the multi-track recording window, then browse down the left-hand side to see the corresponding incoming MIDI channel that your keyboard or whatever is transmitting on. Then what you do is you allocate the track that you want to capture that incoming MIDI, and then on the right you nominate the MIDI output channel and port for that particular keyboard that's expecting the note or data reception, and that's it. Further to that, MIDI tracks with an output status of off will not be recorded. So if you let that sink in for a moment, you'll come to terms with how powerful this is. You could probably get away with recording a dozen keyboards or more simultaneously. And I'm quite sure even the new range of MPCs can't do that, nor many DAWs for that matter. And they should, because any studio with several keyboards could do wonders with a feature like this. The thing with this feature is if you have the same track configured to receive multiple incoming MIDI channels, those incoming MIDI channels will be merged onto the one specified track. But you can choose any of the 64 tracks available from your sequence. So it's probably best to spread them out and use multiple tracks rather than just one track, but it's entirely up to you. There's also a cool trick if you want to trigger the MPC's internal drum programs from an external device, and you could potentially trigger all 4 of them simultaneously too, which is something the MPC can't even do on its own. All you need to do is allocate any of the drum programs across 1 or more tracks, depending on how many you want to record. Then go into multi-recording and allocate those tracks to whichever incoming MIDI instrument you want them to receive from. And the trick is, as they don't need MIDI going out, you can just leave their output port to off because they're internal. Now you could potentially have some friends triggering the drum programs in this MPC from 4 other MPCs or some other kind of MIDI device for that matter. Plus you could jam with a couple of keyboards in addition to all this as well, or potentially an entire band, all being recorded simultaneously across different tracks, which is really nothing short of amazing. And for me, this reinforces the reason why I think the 2000XL is a mini monster. So let's give this a shot, as seeing is believing. And I'm using my Solaris for this demonstration, and that's connected via MIDI cable to the rear of the MPC's MIDI input 1. It's going to record to track 1, and the MIDI out is channel 1 via port A. So I need to look up the second input, which will be here. So for the Jupiter 6, it's input port 2, channel 1, and then we need to set this to 1B because it's going out on port B, channel 1. Okay, there we go. So if we scroll to the top, yep, you can see the track configuration there. That's all great. So now I'll close that, and I might turn on the wait for key function. So when I walk away from the MPC, I can hit a note that will trigger the count in. Okay, so I'm sorry for how basic that is, but anyway, that's 2 keyboards just recorded at the same time. I'll take the wait for key off and we'll play that back. Anyway, there you have it. And just so we've got some full closure on this little multi-track mode, if I jump back in there for a second, you have these curious looking 1X and 2X channels there too. And those are dedicated MIDI system exclusive channels for each port. So you could potentially record patch data or possibly some other type of system configuration data for each particular port exclusively without using up a regular channel. So once you're done using multi-track record mode, make sure you toggle back to single mode because the channel routing from multi-mode will override the individual tracks send and receive channels. And while we're still down in this corner, let's quickly cursor over the track type, whether it's drum or MIDI, and now try hitting open window to reveal a few more interesting options. Starting from the bottom left, we have the incoming MIDI monitor. So if we hit the soft key, we can now test for incoming MIDI transmission from potentially your MIDI keyboards or whatever instrument. So the activity from your external instruments will light up whichever channel they're being received on across whichever port they're connected to. So if I reach over and play some keys on the Solaris, you can see the input channel 1 light up. And so if I reach over and play some keys on the Jupiter 6, we should see some activity coming in on port 2. Cool. Above the incoming MIDI monitor, we have the option to filter out certain MIDI events. So if you enable this on, then cursor down to type, you can scroll the various types of MIDI events that you can filter out from the incoming MIDI transmission. And as we're scrolling through, you can see this pass. So at the moment, exclusive information would be filtered out because pass won't let that through, but notes are allowed to pass through. So you can use that to filter out something in particular. Up in the top left, we have the receive channel, and by default this is set to all, meaning that any MIDI event, regardless of channel, on the port your keyboard is connected to, can be received and recorded onto the currently selected track. So it's kind of like you're listening on all channels for MIDI reception, opposed to just one, where you could ignore every other thing that's coming in. And you might set that up to only be one channel if you've got like a MIDI merger box or something like that with a few keyboards coming in on the one port. We've got a sustain pedal option here, which gives you the ability to record the sustain pedal as a controller event, or to have the sustain pedal event convert into the actual note duration, which might be handy for some. If you want the physical note represented by length rather than another controller, you might have to edit. Across to the top right, we have the program change advanced sequence option. Now this gives you the ability to queue sequences inside the 2000 from an external device. And like I was saying earlier, if I send a program change event from another device into the 2000, whichever number program change I send, will queue up the corresponding sequence number inside the 2000. And that'll play next, which might be useful if you're jamming with two MPCs. Next, we'll take a look at how we can add tempo changes into our sequences. So hitting open window on the tempo field reveals where you can insert specific changes in your sequence's tempo. This process is similar to the step edit functionality by inserting an explicit BPM value at certain points in time. So on this page, you can insert and also delete those changes in tempo. Pressing now inserts the current time displayed on the main screen into your list of tempo changes, and then you can review your tempo changes by cursoring up and down the list. But you might be thinking, this is all well and good for adding explicit changes, but what if I need something more linear to provide a smoother transition? Then unfortunately that would require a handful of manual inserts. But if you drop enough inserts, you can use the percentage value in this field or the explicit value on the right hand side to make small, fragmented but gradual changes towards your target BPM and over a specific range of time too. So it's not that difficult, it's just a little tedious. And so you can add them as you want, and you can also change their location just by selecting whichever field, bar, beat or tick, and then obviously deleting them as you want. So I'll leave that one in there. We'll just quickly check this out. If I give this a little demo, we'll change this up to 105, close the window. So it starts off at 100, then goes to, actually that's too short, let's just make that bar 2, that's good. Okay, so now we'll start at 100, then by the time it gets to bar 2, it'll go to 105 BPM. And you can see this little C, which is showing you the change in tempo. And while we're on this tempo field, I'll quickly touch on the SEQ that you can see here in brackets. This is the tempo that belongs to the sequence. So the alternative option is MAS, which is the master. If you select the master tempo, then the sequence tempo is bypassed on any particular sequence. So if you've got sequences with different tempos and things and you want them all to just play at the master tempo, then select MAS, and then your sequence tempo will be ignored. Okay, so let's quickly have a closer look at this TSeq feature, which allows us to change the time signature of whichever sequence is currently selected. By default, your time signatures will be set to 4/4, and for those that are unfamiliar with signatures, the first number 4 to the left of the / represents how many beats there are in a bar, while the second number, the division, is the length of each beat, or in fractional terms, the 4 can fit into a bar 4 times, therefore it represents 4 quarter notes, hence the 4, which we could change to an 1/8 note, or just about any interval up to 32nd notes. And we can change this 4-beat phrase into a 3 or 5-beat phrase, or whatever you like, simply by dialing in a number and hitting do it. But if you're changing an existing sequence, then just be careful of shortening bars, because essentially you'll cut the last beat out of each bar in your specified range. And if you decide to increase your sequence from 4 beats per bar to something like 5 beats per bar, then blank beats will be added to the end of each bar in this current range you can see on the left. So potentially you could have a sequence with mixed time signatures. So we could have the first 2 bars remain as 4/4, and then I'll apply a 3/4 just to the last 2 bars. And so now if we play that, that's 4/4, that's 4/4, and these will be 3/4. And then back to 4/4. So experiment with this, jump in and try them out, but perhaps make a backup of the sequence you intend to test this out on before you do. Now that we've come this far, I might quickly digress for a moment, as we've covered a lot of features that'll help you set up a studio template. And you might want to name your tracks, and set up your MIDI channels and their devices and the device names, etc. So you'll probably want to save your configuration. The good thing is you can have that configuration load automatically when you power on the 2000. You could also have 1 or more drum programs load automatically too. So to do that, you visit the Shift 3 load page, then press the Setup soft key to configure the AutoLoad feature. If you set this file type here to APS and all, which is the all programs and sounds plus all sequences, then this will load both the APS and all file found in the root directory of whichever primary device you have set here. Alternatively, you could set this to just APS, which will load a bunch of your sounds on power up, or you can have the MPC just load the all file on its own, which may contain 1 or more sequences. The default for this setting is off, but just be mindful not to keep any other APS or all files in your root directory other than the one you want the MPC to load. And I should just mention that you can also choose any of your SCSI devices too, or flash ROM if you've got a flash ROM option installed in your MPC2000, but the SCSI devices might be something like a SCSI to SD or whatever, so you might want to check which SCSI ID they're using to set this, and then you can have something automatically load from another device rather than the Atapi device that I've got here, which is my card reader that I've installed on this one. So getting back to the main screen, next I'll show you the punch in punch out record mode, which is Shift and number 2 on the keypad. And here you can select a few different types of auto punch. You can have punch in only, punch out only, and punch in and out. And this can be useful when you just want to replace a couple of notes in a tight place without harming the notes or controller data before and after that particular position. And it's easy to use. You just nominate your start and end point. Say for example bar 2, and we'll drop out by bar 2 on the 3rd beat. Then you hit the turn on soft key, which will bring you back to main screen, and you'll see the auto punch function is active, and you can switch it off using the soft key, and I could go back and re-enable it. And then this way I could use record and play start or overdub and play start. But if I did record and play start, then it'll just erase that tiny little section that I've nominated for punch in and punch out record. And then when we do the record, you'll see a little graphic representation under the screen of where your virtual playhead is, and then you'll see it come out the other side as well. And now if I go for a record play start, okay, good. Then you can just hit the soft key here to disable the punch feature. So if we jump back into that Shift 2 screen again, and this time we'll take a look at this curious looking second seek. The second seek is a strange little feature you can use under the miscellaneous page, And it's not really something you can use in real time in a live performance situation, but it is useful if you want to try a bass part on sequence 1 against some other type of sequence. So say, for example, the keyboards I recorded earlier as a multi-track recording against this drum sequence we just did a punch-in, punch-out record on. And essentially what it does is play those two sequences over the top of each other, provided you don't exceed the 32 internal voice limit inside the MPC or any of your external devices for that matter. They'll actually just play seamlessly. So I guess you could use it as a little bit of an audition kind of test to play some keyboards over some drums or something. And for an example, I'll play those keyboards that I recorded earlier in multi-track mode over the drums that we've got here. So if I select number 5, which was the keyboards, and it says here, this sequence will play simultaneously with the active sequence or song on the main screen. So if I turn that on, now if I hit play, we'll hear the keyboards underneath these drum parts. Okay, I don't think we need to hear any more of that, but you get the idea. Anyway, I'll go back to the miscellaneous page and we'll check out the last tab we haven't looked at yet, Transpose. And this Transpose feature is a quick way of transposing all tracks in one fell swoop. Opposed to going into the edit page from the main screen and transposing track by track. So with this Transpose, as you can see here, you can select which track or all tracks and how many semitones you want to transpose and from which range of bars. Then instead of do it, we've got fix, which is kind of funny. So for this keyboard part, well, I've got two keyboard parts, so we'll transpose all of them. And I'll transpose it from bar 2, actually, that might be interesting, and then up by 3 semitones, or 4 semitones. Okay, so I'll hit fix. And now it should sound pretty crazy, actually. Anyway, you get the idea. So that's a quick way if you've got a bunch of MIDI parts on one particular sequence that you need transposed. And it should be said that it's not wise to use that on drum tracks, but it's also giving you a little warning of that anyway. So next up, let's have a look at NextSeq. And what this can do is give you an alternate method for queuing up the next sequence, which might be useful if you're playing in a live situation, and rather than dialing it in from the main screen using the data wheel up in this little precarious area, you can then choose the pad soft key, which then queues your sequences by tapping a pad that share a corresponding number. So pad 2 will queue sequence 2, pad 3, sequence 3, etc. And similar with the track mute, the first 16 pads on pad bank A represent the first 16 sequences, and they'll play one after the other continuously too. So let's check that out. I'll cue sequence 2. Anyway, you get the idea there. And if you don't queue up another sequence, the previous will just keep on playing it indefinitely, provided your loop is on, of course. And you've got a couple of other options here. You've got clear and sudden. So rather than wait for the current sequence to complete, just hit the sudden soft key and it'll start playing immediately, like this. Anyway, you get the idea. And clear will just clear the queue or purge whatever's in the queue. So you can see what's queued in the bottom left of the screen here. I can just hit the clear button and now the queue is clear. So I can choose another sequence and now you can see sequence 3 has been queued and that's sitting down there until this current sequence has gone around and then 3 comes in. So now we've got sequence 1 queued, and I can hold down another pad and hit sudden. So it's handy for live performances, that one. And so up here above the next sequence button, we've got the full level. And if you enable this, mine is at the moment with a green light, regardless of how hard or soft you tap your pads, they'll just be struck with full velocity. So if I take that off, I tend to use full velocity when I have to lay down a straight kick or hi-hat pattern, or even a chopped up loop that needs to remain consistent over the course of the whole track. Next to full level, we have 16 levels. And what this does is it gives you different ways to manipulate any one pad sound of your choice, but in varying degrees. For example, if you notice the parameter as velocity, select a pad with a sound on it, then hit the turn on soft key. And you'll have 16 varying degrees of velocity starting from the bottom left, which is the most quiet, all the way up to the loudest variant on the top right. And then you'll have 16 varying degrees of velocity for that one pad. So we can disable that and activate it again. And this time we could choose a different parameter rather than velocity. This time I'll select note variation. Then under that we can change the type from tuning to decay, attack, or even filter. So if we go tuning for now, and then hit the turn on soft key, you'll now get 16 varying degrees of tuning from that snare. So like transposed versions of that particular pad that you selected. Then I could turn on full level and also throw in some note repeat as we covered earlier. You can do all sorts of things really. But before we finish up there, let's go back into 16 levels. And I'll just explain something to you about this original keypad option that you've got here. So if our snare is here, the original pitch will be on pad 4. Or I could change that up to pad 13. Now if I turn that on, the original pitch is now here. And that just gives me a bit more lower variations of it down here. So this time let's try out the filter. Can't really hear it there, maybe the crash sound. Let's jump back in and try out, rather than filter, let's try decay on the crash. Okay, so you get the idea. And similar to 16 levels, we have the note variation fader here, which gives you access to those same types of parameters found in the 16 levels, all except velocity. And you can configure the NV fader by holding down Shift and pressing on the assign key. Then, similar to setting up 16 levels, you tap the pad that you want and then configure the parameter. So again, we could select the same ones: filter, attack, decay, and tuning. But the difference with the NV fader is that you have a range you can specify for this particular parameter. So if we set this tuning that's our high range of tuning. And then instead of that low, that's the lowest we can get. And so if you mess around with the various parameters with a minimal range, then you'll get an idea for what you can do. There's also an after mode, which then gives you the option to bypass any recorded variation movements with the fader. And that can be useful if you want to cut in during a live performance and make changes in real time. And you do that by simply holding down the after button. And so then recorded events are ignored, and then the slider will make changes in real time. And you can also overdub record note variation changes as well. And if you mess something up with an overdub, you could always go into Step Edit and fine-tune those changes, because your fader movements are also logged as events in Step Edit. So you can do quite a lot with this particular fader. In addition to the fader, you've also got an option to assign NV fader to control change. And what this allows you to do is assign a controller ID for this particular fader. So this fader could be controlled via an external MIDI device, provided that the control change ID from the external keyboard is using whichever number you set here. So again, you've got the standard 128 different types. And there's a couple of things you should be aware of about using the note variation fader. You can't use both 16 levels and the NV fader at the same time. Essentially, they're one of the same thing, just different methods of varying those particular parameters. And so I'll show you what I mean. If we try to do 16 levels, turn that on. And now if I try to turn on the fader, the 16 levels disappears. And if I try to do 16 levels, it'll bypass the NV fader. So they're very much just in cahoots with each other, giving you different options, whether it's predefined varying levels or free-flowing fader movements on those particular parameters. The other limitation, if, for example, you're using the filter or tuning and trying to bend the pitch in real time, the fader position from the start of your sample is what your sample will respond to, rather than during the sample playback. So it catches the value rather than bends during sample playback. And I'll show you what I mean. So if I hit the filter all the way up, it won't make a difference. But if I re-trigger it when the filter's down, then you'll hear the change. So if I try to brighten it up mid-sample, it won't happen. It has to be re-triggered. And in case you're not aware, the other caveat is that full level and 16 level and your note variation slider are very much only available to the sounds inside your drum programs and will not work with external MIDI instruments. So next up, and finally, we have song mode. So holding down Shift and hitting 1 on the keypad brings you to song mode. Song mode will literally play through your sequences like a playlist. And starting from the top here, we can add a sequence into step 1, then add another into step 2, and so on. And you can have up to 250 steps, and you can also have some steps repeat. This number here represents the amount of times the sequence at that particular step will repeat before it goes on to play the next step in line. And using these soft keys, labelled Insert or Delete, you can remove or add sequences into your list. Then once you're finished, you could convert this list of sequences back into one big sequence. The song mode conversion will insert tracks into the converted sequence in an attempt to compile all tracks across each of the sequences included in it into one final sequence. So, for example, if you had 32 tracks on sequence 1 and 4 completely different tracks on sequence 2, and then converted them into a sequence using song mode, they'll likely end up with 36 tracks, which can be fine, but you might just want to anticipate that that could be a potential hazard, because a song mode conversion is likely to create new tracks. And if it can't reconcile the tracks in these sequences in the list, it'll just make new ones. Once you've got your sequences all scripted out, you can rename your song. And you can have up to 20 songs at any one time. So you can try out different arrangements of sequences in various order. You can also bypass the tempos associated with each of your sequences by changing the SEQ option to the master tempo and then setting the master tempo here. and that effectively will bypass all the tempos that your sequences may be holding. In addition to that, you can also ignore any tempo changes that may be programmed into any of your sequences too by hitting Open Window and enabling the Ignore Tempo Change events in sequence, so up to you. And last of all, you can loop your song continuously here by enabling Loop to On, or you could hit Open Window and key in a specific range for song mode to play continuously between a first step and a last step, or even number of steps, similar to the main screen loop. And let's just make one more. And let's use master and set that to 105. Bit too fast. Right, let's convert that. Yep, that's fine. Do it. And now the song is now a sequence. And you can see the number of bars. So there you have it. I'm sure I've bored you to death, but it's a pretty comprehensive sequencer loaded with just about everything you'll ever need for a dedicated MIDI studio. Anyway, I hope that's helped you out. If it has, hit the like button, subscribe, ding the bell, and check out the channel for more walkthroughs just like this one. And there's also a ToneLab Instagram and Facebook page you can check out too. So check the description area below for details. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.